Welcome to the Not Even Wine with Dinner podcast. I'm your host, Kristen, and we are here to talk about all things life, love, loss, and liquor. So let's uncork the bottle and get this party started. Well, hello, everybody. This is Kristen, and you are listening to the Not Even Wine with Dinner podcast, episode number 19, Drinking is Fun and Other Things We Learn from Grown-Ups. All right, so today, what I'd like to talk about is the illusion that drinking is fun. And I am specifically talking about the demographic that grew up with a family maybe that was just immersed in cocktail culture or having, weekend barbecues or cocktail parties, whatever you want to call them. I grew up in the 70s, so I'm going to refer to them as cocktail parties and cocktail culture. My parents grew up in the 50s, so that was very much what that was. And the reason I say this demographic is because there are countless stories of people who had traumatic childhoods because of growing up in an alcoholic household with an alcoholic parent, sibling, aunt, uncle, grandparent, whatever. And they were traumatized by alcohol. What I'm referring to is where you grew up thinking that drinking was fun. And that was the perception that you received as a kid. So what I want to do is start by setting the stage of my childhood and what I saw. So again, growing up in the 70s, and it was not uncommon for my parents to have cocktail parties. And so what would happen is a Saturday night would roll around. I would already be ready for bed. And we're talking about the ages, oh my gosh, I would say 7 to 10. Robin wasn't necessarily there because she would go off and have a sleepover or be out with her friends or whatnot. So I would be home alone with my parents. And as the parties would start, everybody would start to come. I would be allowed to, say hello. I'd get hugs and kisses, and I'd be running around in my footy pajamas. And then if it was in the winter, I would be in charge of taking the coats and putting them on the coat bed, which was my parents' bedroom. And then I would dive into all of the rabbit fur jackets because, again, this was the 70s and a lot of women had real rabbit fur coats. Sorry, PETA, but that was the time. And so it was like a big deal if you were a kid to go like hang out in the coat room and like rustle and nestle in all the fur. Oh my God, that sounds terrible. But then at a certain point, I would be sent off to my room. And I would go in my room. I had a teeny tiny little 13-inch black and white TV, my record player, my Barbie townhouse, and I would just hang out in my room and entertain myself. What I would hear was the sounds beyond the wall. And I could hear the party happening, and I could hear the clinking of the ice and the clinking of the swizzle sticks, maybe cracking open of bottles. Because at that time, it mostly was wine and spirits, wine and cocktails. There wasn't really beer drinking going on in those environments. So you would hear all these noises, and then you would hear a lot of laughter. You would hear people talking and mumbling and storytelling, and then a huge eruption of laughter. As I got bolder, I would sometimes sneak out of my room and then go around the corner and peer around the wall. And, you would see people sometimes sitting and just enjoying, conversation, or sometimes somebody would be up in the middle of the room, really animated, like arms waving and flailing, telling a story, and everyone would be laughing. As the night wore on, occasionally you would hear a stumble because somebody was getting drunk, and they would stumble and everyone would laugh. And then at the end of the night, everybody would wrap up and leave, and that would be that. A few other tales I want to share was when we would go to the beach. We would go to the beach for a couple weeks every summer. Usually, from what I remember, there might be beer drinking in the evening. We would sit on an enclosed porch and listen to the radio, and there would be people kind of coming and going from the other beach houses. And my parents might have a beer, or during the day, if they were day drinking on the beach, it was like gin and tonics. So that was always something in my mind I considered a summer drink. And it's really weird because when I tell this story, I see the bottles of like Beef Eater gin or J&B Scotch. Like those are the images that kind of get conjured up in my brain. Again, everybody was laughing. Everybody was having fun. Everybody was having a good time. Um, Drinking was fun. If there was a picnic or a company party and there was any kind of alcohol, it was usually beer. So the beer drinking was, reserved for, I think of football games. I think of my youth, and I think of, going to friends' houses and having football parties and stuff like that. But it may be a beer here or there. Even my grandfather, who was an alcoholic, I remember as I got older, and I think his drinking had slowed down, him always drinking beer, but he would drink it in a Pilsner glass. So it was almost like a formality, I guess. In my mind, everything was fun. And I think what happens is that you start to conjure up this image in your head as a kid of like, ooh, I can't wait to drink. And it even goes back as far as when you start to ask, ooh, can I have a sip? And on occasion, my parents would give me a sip of a beer or a sip of a wine, which I thought all of that was disgusting. I thought all of it tasted nasty. I had no interest in it. So it wasn't so much about the drink as it was the intrigue or the curiosity of, you have something that I don't have. You have something that is perceived as adult. And so when I get that sip, I'm entering into the adult world and I am doing something that's almost like taboo for a child. And you feel this, I don't know, like this feeling of like, like I just got away with something. I had a sip of beer. And you might tell your friends, I got to take a sip of daddy's beer this weekend. It was nasty, but I got to take a sip of his beer. And so there is this sense of intrigue and curiosity. And I just think that you think like, I can't wait. And I think I might have even said that at some point. And my dad would have been the one, I'm sure, to say like, you don't need to worry about drinking. Don't worry about it. But when I go back, I just think about it all at that age, going up to elementary school. Things started to shift into junior high a little, but I'll get to that. But everything appeared fun. Even when we first moved to Texas, I think I can remember us going to a flea market called Trader's Village. If you're from Dallas-Fort Worth area, you'll know what I'm talking about. And back then, it was a really fun experience. We would go, it was a lot of thrift and antiques, and my parents would always get a beer. Hell, I think about, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around, but when I think about that, obviously what you might think of is, well, wait a minute, you drove somewhere and now they're drinking and they're going to drive home with their kid in the car. Yeah, that's what people did. They didn't get drunk. They might have one or two beers at Trader's Village and then we would go home. Nevertheless, it's not right. It's illegal. But even in that same era, I can remember us going to like on a Sunday drive where my parents would want to go, find some antique malls or places to kind of go poke around and little places to go shop and stop, and always having a cooler in the car that maybe had a few snacks and a couple of beers. And this was, again, 70s, early 80s. So it was before open container laws. It was well before Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It just was like this thing that was acceptable. Let's get a six pack and go drive around. But okay, back to my whole point is it was viewed by me as a child as being fun. And I guess the thing is, I want to just stress how dangerous that is. So I am not putting any blame on my parents. I am not saying that they exposed me to something so horrific that that's the reason that I turned into a functioning alcoholic. If you have read any of my stories or listened to this podcast, you'll know a lot of it came because I had really low self-esteem after we moved and I got bullied and peer pressure, et cetera, et cetera. But even before that, there was still that exposure of drinking is fun. And you, I think, move into your teen years and think, well, my parents like it. Why shouldn't I? So what happened is that when I started getting into my teen years, and I had all these issues, I remember having that first beer. I remember having the first beer at my friend Debbie's house. there were some friends over, and I remember taking that first sip and thinking, ugh, this is so disgusting. How am I going to get through this can of beer? But I didn't want to be the one to say, I don't want to drink this or no, thank you, because I would have been like even nerdier than I was already considered. And I didn't want to be an outcast. I was so desperate for attention and for some sort of positive reinforcement that I just drank it. I sipped my way through it and struggled my way through it. And that was the beginning of my drinking career. So once you get to that next level, so, you grow up as a kid, you have this exposure, you assume drinking is fun, it's okay to do, I can't wait to do it. It's clearly acceptable when I become old enough to drink. Chances are, if you're exposed to it as a preteen or a teen, you might start early if you have access. You might try it, especially if you're having any kind of self-esteem issues. And that's when the changes start to come in. I also think what can happen is in a relationship, the more you're together with somebody, maybe I'm stereotyping, I don't know. When you start dating, it's fun. When you get married, it's fun. When you are together with somebody for years and years and decades, and you start to have that shift in your relationship with different nuances, or all of a sudden I don't like the way my spouse does this, that, or the other, and then you throw alcohol on top of it, it now starts to create problems. That is not for the person who drinks a glass of wine with dinner or has one beer when they watch a football game. It's those who keep drinking, who maybe you want to get a little tipsy, like, hey, I want to have a couple drinks. I feel like getting a little drunk this weekend. And then you start adding in, relational problems, whether it is a friend, a family member, or a partner. And that's when the changes start to occur. And then you start to realize that the fun fades. And unfortunately, it's a slow, creepy process. I don't think it happens quickly. I think that it happens over time. I didn't become an alcoholic at age 12, but I will say that I started drinking at 12 because that is when I had my first full beer. And when it was presented to me, I drank. Even if I had a half a beer or I had 2 or 3 beers, I started drinking at 12. So I didn't start out as a quote unquote alcoholic. It was something that just became like this snowball, and it was a snowball effect. And the more you're exposed to these other kids and other teens and then other young adults, and it's so accepted in our culture, you just continue to do it. And I feel like, I think I may have said this maybe last week or the week before when I did the last one about like kind of how an alcoholic is born, like, baby's first beer. I think it was last time. I can't remember which episode it is. I'll link it below. But it is just a slow and creeping process. Where I'm going with this, I wanted to share that story because I think it's important to understand how it affects children. Now, I think a lot of my audience tends to be 40s and up. But, sometimes there are 20s and 30s in here. So I'm talking to you if you're newer parents, but even those who are in their 40s and 50s and your grandparents. My message is to be careful. Be careful of what you're exposing the kids to. Now, the good thing, I do believe that statistically right now, teenage drinking is down. And that's probably because teens are now addicted to social media, which is not good. It's a different kind of addiction. And it is a more, I don't know, maybe I'm going out of my comfort zone saying this. I feel like that's almost a more cerebral addiction because it's affecting the brain development in a different way. So that is a good thing as far as the fact that the teenage alcohol consumption is lower. But my point is, if you're having that party and the kids are around, just be careful of what you're exposing them to. It's okay to separate the kids and say, you know what, why don't you guys go play in another room? Or when they ask for a sip, say no. Say, you know what, no, when you're whatever your drinking age is, 18, 19, 21, depending on where you are on the globe, you can wait until you're that age. Now, when I say that, I do realize there are cultures that allow kids to drink like little lightweight wines with dinner, like in France. But again, I'm talking about when you're having an all out balls out party, like when you're having that big cocktail party or you're having a big drink fest and you got a lot of friends over and the coolers are full and the fridge is full and the bar is fully stocked. That is when I really highly recommend watching over the children and watching what they are being exposed to, because you're influencing them. I'm not suggesting you throw them all in a room with a bunch of tablets because that's not any better with addiction. Finding something for them to do that's creative might be okay. Don't underestimate your kids. Don't underestimate your teens. Don't think that they're not watching. I could tell you back in my youth where I have been in a house with people smoking weed and drinking, and they were younger parents, so there was a kid in the room, and maybe it was a toddler. And they'd be like, we would be passing a bong around, and a toddler's in the room. I was always uncomfortable with that scenario, and I would comment on it like, are you sure you want to do this? And then they would be like, they don't know what it is, or they have no idea, or don't worry, no, they're fine. And I remember always thinking, that is so freaking weird. Like, I just don't understand this, because kids absorb everything. I can remember memories that I have, some very specific, probably back to age, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, like kindergarten years. So that would have been 4 for me. I can remember my preschool years. Kids absorb everything. They're very, very observant. They're very intelligent, and they're far more intelligent than a lot of adults give them credit for. But when I became a step parent, it was very important to me not to drink around the kids. I was like, I don't want to be a part of that. I do not want to be that kind of a negative influence on these kids, especially because they're not my kids, like biologically. I just felt like that was part of my responsibility. Now, some of you might be like, okay, you're just being ridiculous. Kids are going to do what they're going to do. I saw where am I going with this? My ex-boyfriend had twin nieces, and I can vividly remember when they turned 12. These girls were good girls, straight A students, very well monitored, and I knew that they were pretty much goody two-shoes, so good for them. But the epiphany that I had was I just looked at them one day and went, holy shit, look at these like little kids. I know what I was doing when I was their age, and it wasn't good. I wasn't a bad kid. I wasn't a troublemaker. I kept a good goody two shoes persona in my house. But when I was away with the friends that I was exposed to that didn't have a lot of supervision in their homes, and that's when all the shit went down. When I was over at Debbie's house, all the fun stuff happened, and I was drinking and I was smoking and I was meeting boys, and I was like not just meeting boys, I was meeting men. I was meeting guys with facial hair when I was 12, 13 years old. I wasn't doing anything with them, but I was exposed to a lot of stuff at that age. So again, don't underestimate your kids. Watch what you're doing around them. Pay attention. If you watch kids, man, I'm telling you, they're watching everything you're doing. So make it good stuff. Make it good choices. And again, even if you're older than I am, I'm in my 50s. If you're in your 60s and you're like, this is past my point, then tell it to your kids, tell it to your grandchildren, like pass this down, because it's really important to know that they're watching everything that you do. And while drinking can be fun, I had some really great times with a few drinks. I've got some drunk stories that, they were fun times. And I don't like to pretend they didn't happen. Just be very careful. Be careful what you're exposing your kids to, because they're watching everything you do. So on that teaching note, I hope you guys have a fantastic day. I hope you have a fantastic week. And I actually have a story. I wrote this story like a year or two ago, and I'm going to link it to the show notes. So if you want to read what I wrote, Same thing. I think it's just a little more of a narrative. I'll link it in the show notes. And on that note, I hope you guys have a fantastic week. As always, remember, stay safe, stay sober. Just a quick note of the legal jargon. I am not a medical or psychiatric professional, nor am I a recovery or addiction specialist. This podcast is for information use only, and I am simply sharing my own experiences with sobriety, drinking, mental health, and wellness. I'm not here to diagnose or to treat. So if you're struggling and you feel like you are in immediate need, please contact a medical professional or call 911. Thank you guys again. Stay safe, stay sober.